Feathers hung in the air like slow snow inside the Whitaker living room, soft, obscene against the marble and glass. A pale, impossible snowfall from a dozen ripped pillows. A toy dump truck lay on its side near a toppled lamp. Syrup had crusted in a dark smear across the rug, the smell of pancakes and chaos mixing with the cold perfume of a house that had stopped pretending the way grief smells. 3 small faces, Tommy, Danny, and Bobby, stared from behind a tower of overturned cushions, eyes rimmed red but ferocious, as if they could dare the world to come closer. They had learned a language in which anger spoke louder than tears, and they spoke it fluently. On the landing above, John Whitaker stood perfectly still. He was tall enough to see the whole room without moving, the most expensive suit he owned bent in exhaustion, hair too long at the temples. His hands were empty. Money could not hold a child's hand. The framed photos of Sarah, smiling, arm around one of the boys, seemed to multiply, filling every flat surface with evidence of absence. Here, in the silence between the boys' small explosions, the absence pressed like a second shadow. They had fired 17 nannies in 6 months. The town's gossip already had a headline. A tabloid photographer's flash months ago had caught a boy throwing a stuffed bear at a gardener. Another nanny left with her spine bent by public whispers. Each departure was a small internal collapse in the house, another proof that the family's wealth could not buy the thing it needed most. Someone who knew what to do with children whose behavior was grief's translation into movement. She stood in the doorway for a long minute, watching. Belinda Johnson, hands folded around a paper grocery bag that held a thermos and a tin of freshly baked cookies. She had taken off her raincoat in the car and let the drizzle collect on her hair like small, cleansing doubts. The rain had washed the city gray and left her apartment smelling like lemon dish soap and the faint, perpetual perfume of thrift store curtains. At 30, she carried years in the way her shoulders sat, steady, kind of worn, and not willing to be hurried. Belinda had read the ad and knew the code before she opened the envelope. Temporary position, maternity coverage, must be experienced with young children. The ad meant grief, only no business would write that word. She had seen that particular anger before, the way small hands could do harm to a room, because harm had already been done to their interior worlds. It lived in foster homes she'd known, in the ear-splitting silence of a child who had learned that big people left when they became inconvenient to pain. Her own childhood had been circulated through strangers' houses, like change passed from hand to hand. She had learned to measure people by the steadiness of their eyes more than by their words. In a small metal locker behind an agency's desk, she'd once kept a folded photograph of a girl she couldn't remember loving. Now, months of caring for other people's children had braided into something practical, patience she could manufacture like a slow recipe. Foster care had taught her 2 things: how to read the space between a child's words and how little the world distinguished initials on a bank account from a heart that would show up night after night. Those lessons were not trophies. They were tools. Belinda stepped into the living room and set down the thermos. The air felt wrong, too formal, too precious, like the house thought it could maintain dignity by forbidding mess. The boys watched her with the kind of suspicion only small children can make weaponized. She did not move fast. She did not speak loudly. She sat on the floor where the syrup clung, got cookie crumbs on her jeans, and opened the tin. "You brought cookies?" Tommy said. His voice was sharp like sugar shards. "I brought cookies," Belinda agreed. "I always bring cookies to see if they'll talk." She smiled without demanding their trust. She held out a cookie. The tallest boy took it like a small truce. The others followed, a choreography they had used with strangers for months. Test, evaluate, retreat, then test again. That first minute, Belinda noticed the small things other people overlooked. A bandage on Bobby's knee that was too white, not because it was clean, but because it had been changed and readjusted too often. The way Tommy kept clenching his fists after smiling, the way Danny's thumb rubbed the threadbare seam of a stuffed rabbit until his whole arm trembled. The boys were not monsters, she told herself. They were containers of a sorrow that would not fit in the neat rooms around them. John watched, something unnamed moving in him. He had hired many professionals, therapists, tutors, play specialists, an array of initials and credentials that created a paper trail of good intentions. Many had family-friendly tones and clipboard smiles. Some had been stern and practical, trying to impose order. None had lasted. Belinda had something none of them offered in their brochures. Not a degree, she had said plainly in the interview, but a willingness to be ordinary in the ways children needed. Messy, constant, real. The living room did not explode into immediate harmony. There were more spills, a ruined vase, a toy train that somehow ended up in the fish tank. Belinda did not scold. She knelt close enough to be in the boys' space and told a story that had nothing to do with loss, a ridiculous tale of a squirrel who wore socks. Her rhythm slowed them without shaming them. Laughter came like a crack of light. It was thin and suspicious, but real. Within an hour, she knew things the house did not teach. The boys laced grief with defiance. They punished anyone who moved too close by acting out. They tested whether attachments would break under pressure. So she did two basic stubborn things. She named the sadness when it came, and she refused to be driven away by misbehavior. When Tommy threw a block at the television, she did not raise her voice. She called him by his name and said, "That looks like it hurled because it hurts. I'm not leaving." The name settled in like salt in a wound. The boy blinked as if someone had remembered to tend him. The first day was a map of small experiments. At lunch, she warmed soup in a tin she had bought when she'd been paid early and had a little extra. The boys hovered at first, then sat. When Danny smeared his spoon in his hair, Belinda rubbed his back and said, "This is fine. We are making a mess of our grief, and that's okay." It was not revolutionary. It was radical to two boys who had been told too often that their messes made adults leave. By the afternoon, John had been given a cup of coffee that tasted less like a thermos and more like someone had removed a layer of fatigue. He leaned against a column and watched Belinda unfold routines he had tried to schedule into his life. She read a book by the window, letting the boys interrupt her with questions, answering not by dismissing, but by bending truth into something they could swallow. She showed photos of his wife in a way that did not turn them into shrines. "We can remember her in pieces we like," she said softly, handing a photo to Tommy. "We don't have to carry the parts that hurt on the front." The boy took the picture and looked at Sarah's face for a long beat before returning it. Belinda's hands were decisive in small ways. She tied shoelaces with a rhythm that implied tomorrow. She smoothed a pillow and tucked away a stuffed animal so Bobby would not lose it. She was not the bravest person in the room. She was simply the one who had learned to keep returning when it was easier to leave. She knew that consistency, not theatrical gestures, would untangle the knots. It was that evening, when the house had settled into a tired kind of harmony, and the boys were scrubbing peanut butter off the coffee table with deliberate intent, that the camera phone appeared. One of John's aides had recorded a few clips, then emailed them to a friend. The clip was innocent. A shot of three boys sitting side by side, sharing a cookie, laughing with syrup on their chins. To Belinda, it felt like a mosaic, small tiles of recovery, nothing more. To a news cycle hungry for a story of wealth and chaos, it would be evidence to be rewritten. She did not know the headline yet. She only knew the quiet when she tucked the boys into bed. Bedtime had transformed into ritual in 2 days. Belinda told a story about a small moon who could not sleep. A silly tale built from things the boys liked, and from the way their faces softened when they listened. She let them keep a piece of Sarah's scarf, a small permission she had asked John for when he had left the house that morning. The boys' hands explored the fabric like a map, finding safety in threadwork. Tommy asked at last, "Is Mama proud of us?" Belinda felt the chair under her knees like an anchor. "I think she would be," she said. She spoke gently, careful to hold possibility and reality together. "And I think she wanted you to be brave, which you have been. Brave looks different when you're 6. There was no therapy speech in her words, only the tone of someone who had been 6 and broken, and then gently mended. When she left that night, John stopped her on the stairs. He had a cup of coffee turning cold in his hand. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, he looked like a man who might accept help without complaining about the price. Did you mean what you said in the interview?" he asked. "That you'd tell the boys the truth in ways they can hold?" Belinda met his eyes. "I told you I had been through things," she said. "I didn't tell you I was a magician. I said I come back. I stay. She did not frame her foster care past as a credential, only as a map that had taught her to show up. He exhaled something that might have been hope. Stay, he echoed, like he was promising not to run either. The early days were a patchwork of small wins and setbacks. One afternoon, Bobby shoved a bowl off the table when Belinda told him they would be visiting Sarah's grave. The bowl smashed, and sugar flourished across the tiles like broken snowfall. For a second, the house reverted to its earlier panic. John's jaw tightened, and a memory of an earlier nanny yelling crossed Belinda's mind like an unwelcome photo. But she did not yell. She sat on the floor and began to sweep. She said nothing grand. She simply put her hand on Bobby's shoulder and drew him into the work. He cried, because the grief had found a way into his bones, and because finally someone did not leave when the mess arrived. That evening, John walked into the kitchen and found the three boys helping Belinda make a simple cake. Flour sat dusted on their eyelashes. They were absorbed in measuring and pouring and whispering about the moon and Belinda's stories. John stood with his coffee unmoving for a long moment. He had built companies that were temples of logic and numbers, but he had not been taught how to share the sticky-handed things of healing. He was learning by watching. Word traveled outward like it always does. A local blogger who had once written about a Whitaker gala tweeted a grainy clip of the boys sharing cookies, with a caption that implied redemption. Are the billionaire Whitakers finally getting their act together? New nanny shares pics. Within hours, the clip had been recontextualized into the media's appetite for drama. Former nannies, interviewed by a petty channel that liked the angle of spoiled children in a gilded cage, offered sharp quotes alleging instability and challenging behavior. The tabloids were drawn to the story the way moths are to porch lights, hungry, neighborly, relentless. Belinda ignored the first round of noise. She had learned not to feed storms. Her concern was internal, the boys' rhythm, what they would carry away from each day. But the noise did not stay external for long. A social worker calling from the county office asked concerned questions, because that was what protocol required when a family had snapped through multiple caregivers in a short time. The call arrived the way these calls always do. Formal, precise, fit into a box. It registered in Belinda's mind, not as accusation but as an obstacle. There would be paperwork. There would be a day when the house would be watched closely by a stranger with a ledger. She thought without drama that the family should not be afraid of being seen. On a rainy Thursday, Belinda sat on the back stoop in the gray light, thermos in her hands, and breathed the steam away. She thought of the foster homes that had been hers, houses whose walls had taught her how to stretch comfort thin and make it last. She thought of the small girl in the picture she had once kept. She could not remember all the names of the people who had packed her up and shipped her to new possibilities, but she remembered the one who had stayed around the supper table and let the children be loud. That one person, she believed, changed a childhood. In the Whitaker house, she began to build those small changes with ritual. A cookie tin that traveled to school events. A thermos that John begrudgingly refilled and kept warm on his brief mornings at home. A picture of Sarah placed on a lower shelf where the boys could reach it without reverence. She started a weird, private tradition no one had suggested. Friday pancakes with a plate kept for Sarah. They ate pancakes shaped like stars and left a single syrup-dusted pancake on a plate near Sarah's photo. It was not a prayer. It was remembrance with texture. The boys liked it because it meant routine. John liked it because it was a way to act when words were insufficient. Belinda's approach did not win immediate allies. The Whitaker circle included those who considered herself an interloper in a world she had not been invited into by pedigree. Some staff whispered about credentials. One of the former nannies, pressed by a hungry reporter, muttered harshly about the challenge of discipline and boundaries. The headlines were a shallow mirror that made the house look like a problem set. But for the boys, for John, for the people who ate the pancakes and wrapped the scarf around a small stuffed rabbit, it felt like a revolution only because nobody had ever thought to be so patiently ordinary. After 2 weeks, a neighbor's child walked by and told a friend on the stoop about the Whitaker boys and the woman who baked cookies. The gossip that usually delighted in scandal found something softer to hold. People talked about the laughter that seemed to leak out of the house now, about the sight of John wheeling a stroller with a grocery bag inside, like a man learning to accept mundane domesticity. Belinda kept a small secret ledger. It was not for clients or agencies. She scribbled one-sentence notes. Tommy picked up his shoes. No prompting. Danny ate a full sandwich at lunch. Bobby folded his napkin. The notes read like a liturgy of tiny victories. She did not let them become proof for others. They were reminders for herself that steadiness mattered. The press, meanwhile, found new angles. When a gossip column called 17 Nannies Couldn't Handle Them popped back into circulation, it redeployed the family's trauma as spectacle. John watched one evening as a headline paraded the boys' worst moments like proof of parental failure. The shame prickled in him, deep and old as any ruined apple. He had tried to armor the boys from the world. He had failed. Watching the story spin, he thought of every decision he had made, and every time he had chosen work over presence. Guilt is a quiet creditor. It collects interest. Belinda cut the paper out of his hand and put it in the trash. She did not advocate for denial. She said, "We don't live in the paper. We live here." Her voice was not scolding. It was a fact. She refused to let a headline define those boys. Her work could not be undone by a camera. But she also knew the world beyond the gate had power. Power to call services, to call social workers. That power needed to be met with openness. When Mrs. Rodriguez called to say she might stop by for a routine check, one of the outcomes when a household sees a spike in concerns, Belinda said, "Bring your lunch. Come for the day." It was a blunt invitation. If anyone wanted to know what healing looked like, come see a whole day of it. She suggested transparency because what scared people most was the unknown. John hesitated. Protocol told him to be cautious with outsiders, but Belinda's suggestion carried no drama. It proposed the obvious. Let people see what was happening. If the house could be seen for what it was, a work in progress but a place of steady tending, then perhaps the rumors would find less purchase. She had not expected his agreement to be immediate. He had been a CEO who measured risk with spreadsheets, yet something in him had shifted enough to consider the offer. Perhaps it was the ease with which the boys now slid into small patterns, or the way he woke one morning to find his 3 sons arranging his desk toys into a parade, a mockery of work that still included him. He saw in Belinda not a technician, but a companion who offered a different metric of success. The slow accrual of trust. 2 days before the scheduled visit, Belinda walked into the boys' room with a shoebox. Inside were craft supplies, bits of ribbon, buttons, paper cutouts, and a small set of clay. She asked them simply to make a picture for Mama they would leave at the grave. They worked with solemn concentration, and sometimes laughter burbled up when someone's clay figure collapsed into a sad, adorable blob. The work of remembering with hands, she'd learned, was less dangerous than the work of remembering with words only. Tommy made a picture with a sun and a swing. Danny crafted a lopsided heart. Bobby, who rarely made anything on purpose, pressed clay into a shape that could have been a boat or a bird. Each piece held a trace of them, small, intact, complicated. They wrapped each object in tissue and put them in the shoebox like offerings. Belinda watched from the doorway as the boys tucked the box under a pillow, and then later, as they slept with the memory of making something held close. It was a small scene. It was also a decision. The family would take grief into its palms and make offerings, not walled-off shrines. That decision rippled, in the way that small domestic acts always do, toward something larger. It would not save them from every outside voice or keep them from every hard day, but it would make them theirs again. On the morning the social worker was due, the house smelled like pancakes and coffee. Belinda had made enough syrup for a small army. John had called in early, as much a gesture for himself as a practical step. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with the professional wariness of someone used to seeing fractured pictures of families. She had been to homes where chaos bred neglect, and homes where chaos hid abuse. She had not come for drama. She had come for truth. Belinda opened the door and offered a thermos. "We'll keep you caffeinated," she said. Mrs. Rodriguez accepted, her posture loosening like a hinge that had been oiled. The house did not present itself as perfect. It presented itself as something alive. A place where sand stayed in pockets, where a ruined vase had been swept up, and where a photograph of Sarah sat at the table with a small plate beside it holding a syrup-stained pancake. The social worker followed the boys' morning, breakfast, a quick art project, a conversation about school, and sat through a reading with Belinda on the sunlit rug, while a small dog from a neighbor's house wandered in and out, causing a boy to erupt in delighted shrieks. She watched the ritual of them leaving a pancake by Sarah's photo, then sat quietly as the boys told stories about her in ways that were not always linear, but were deeply theirs. By the time Mrs. Rodriguez left, it was raining again, a sort of gentle punctuation. She walked back to her car and looked at Belinda. "They're being seen," she said simply, and it read like both observation and verdict. She marked the notes in her clipboard with a different tone than she had arrived with, less suspicion, more cautious hope. Belinda did not dance when the social worker left. She did not need to. Hope was thin and durable and not meant to be flaunted. She returned to the kitchen and rinsed a pan, the motion steady. The house smelled of lemon and coffee and wet wool. She put the pan to dry and sat at the small kitchen table where John once left memos about meetings. That week, a reporter phoned for comment. One of many calls that blurred into a background hum. Belinda spoke plainly. "These are grieving children. They need people who show up more than people who make speeches." She was careful with her words. She did not promise dramatic recoveries. She offered facts and presence. Her honesty threw the media a new color, not headline fodder, but the slow, uncompelling rhythm of real life. The story did not die. The machine moved on its usual tracks. But the difference was that when cameras circled, the family had a living account to show. Not a pristine, staged household, but a household that had picked up, piece by piece, its capacity to be ordinary again. It was not spectacular, it was steady. That steadiness accumulated its own quiet publicity. People noticed that the boys were less likely to vanish into fury, and more likely to sit under trees and let Belinda braid their hair. Still, even as small victories stacked like bricks, Belinda remained aware of the precariousness of public perception. She kept her ledger of one-line notes and wrote at the bottom of each day's page, "One more day." It was a phrase that held both ambition and patience, a plan that did not seek fireworks but endurance. On a Sunday in late autumn, when the leaves around the Whitaker estate started to go brittle and the garden took on the brittle gold of the season, John stood at the grave of his wife with his sons and Belinda beside him. It was not a cinematic moment intended for other people's applause. It was private and small, the boys placing a clay bird on the stone, a pancake wrapped gently and set aside. The camera was not there. The memory would not be replayed on a news channel. It was for them, for the slow work of making grief an inhabitant at the table rather than a permanent guest. Tommy, fidgeting with the clay, looked up and said, voice honest and small, "Do you think Mama would like the bird?" "She would," Belinda answered without hesitation, because she had learned not to hedge in the face of a child's need. "She would like that you made it." The boy's face softened like a lock opening. He put his hand on the stone as if he could feel something respond. John felt something in his chest he had not felt in months, something that might someday be called relief, but in that moment was simply a loosening. He had been absent from his sons' interior lives for too long. He was learning to be a visitor in their small, shifting inner rooms. Watching Belinda, he said aloud, as if to himself, "Thank you." Belinda looked up and met his eyes. She did not accept thanks as if it were a final settlement. She knew the work would continue. She also knew that the house had gone from a place of sharp exits to a space where people returned. That was her measure. When the night came and the boys' laughter had long smoothed into respirations, Belinda sat at the kitchen counter and opened her small ledger. She flipped through the days like pages of a plant, finally deciding to grow toward light. Across the bottom of one page, she wrote a single line. Small, consistent gestures. A phone buzzed on the counter, an alert from a phone the agency had left her in case of emergencies. She glanced at it and saw a headline scroll across the screen. The thumbnail image was of 3 small boys in a room, one with syrup still in his hair. The headline stabbed at the calm she had built. Billionaire's triplets, chaotic home, or grief-stricken children. Former nannies speak out. Belinda felt the room narrow for a moment, like someone had briefly tightened a hand around her ribs. The headline promised drama, and the story would be simpler for having it. She set the phone face down and let the sound of the house, murmured televisions, the hum of late-night appliances fill the space. She could have left. Any number of people in her position would have left. The story could hurt them. It could call authority to the gate. But leave was not the option she had chosen when she had put the thermos and the cookies in her bag and walked through the rain to knock on the Whitaker door. Foster care had not taught her to abandon when storms came. It had taught her to shelter those small enough to need it. A new morning would bring judgments, calls, and perhaps formal visits. It would also bring the boys, with their hurried hands and persistent laughter. Belinda closed the ledger, tucked it into the tin of cookies she kept for days like this, and stood to pour herself a cup of coffee. The house would be seen by others. She would help it be seen as it was, messy, hopeful, in progress. The next morning, the headline had multiplied. It crawled across screens and slid into comment threads with the mechanical cheerfulness of gossip turning into verdict. Billionaire's triplets, unruly or unwell. The article recycled the same footage, the same clipped interviews with former nannies whose faces were tight with relief at the camera's attention. The language was careful where it needed to be legal, cruel where it could be clickbait. Somewhere in the middle of the page was a small, dismissive aside. New nanny is black. It was not malicious exactly. It was a note, an extra detail strummed for its potential to color readers' minds. Belinda set her coffee down and watched the steam braid with the sunlight that cut through the blinds. She noticed the phrase like a sting of cold air in the room. She had expected attention. This city had breath short enough to blow up anything. But she had not expected the way strangers could fold an identity into an accusation without meeting a person. John came down in a shirt with no tie, one sleeve rolled as if he had tried to teach himself gentleness that morning. He picked up the paper without looking at it first, then stopped, then swallowed, then read. His face did something like a small break. "They called you a..." He hesitated, the word caught on the edge of his mouth. He did not finish the sentence because there were several ways a sentence like that might become unfair. Belinda slid the tin of cookies toward him. "They'll keep writing," she said. "That's what they do. They don't have to live here." She placed a hand on the table where the paper lay and did not press it flat. "We do." The calls came in a steady, hungry drip. Some were polite inquiries. Some were sharp, like someone testing a seam. An assistant left a voicemail about a camera crew asking to film family life. A neighbor's report landed in the county office with a complaint about potential neglect due to repeated caregiver turnover. The complaint could have been automatic, protocol moving in the direction of paperwork, or it could have been venom. Either way, it triggered a set of procedures that required attention. The machinery of institutions was not purposefully cruel. It was designed to sift fast to safety. In a household like the Whitakers, that sifting felt like a gale. Belinda did not panic. Her ledger sat in the drawer beneath the sugar bowl like a small liturgy. She opened it and read the one-line notes. Tommy picked shoes. No prompting. Danny ate a sandwich. Bobby folded napkin. She wrote a new line, and beneath it wrote, "Invite openness." She picked up the phone and called the agency that had placed her. "We're doing a full-day observation," she told them. "Mrs. Rodriguez should come back if she needs to." She did not ask permission. She organized. Mrs. Rodriguez returned, this time by appointment and with paperwork that had a slightly sharper edge. She arrived in the late morning with the practical softness of someone whose work required both caution and a capacity to be surprised. There was the inspection protocol, yes, a checklist in a neat folder. But what mattered more was what she saw. John pouring cereal into 3 bowls with hands that trembled at first, and then steadied. Belinda tying one of the boy's shoes with the kind of absent-minded tenderness that made the boy look down and smile. The photo of Sarah with a syrup-stained pancake placed beside it like a ritual that refused to stay sad. Mrs. Rodriguez watched the shoebox craft offerings they were packing for the grave. Clay birds, a lopsided heart, a sun and swing drawing, and watched Bobby tuck a ribbon around the parcel, as if fastening his courage. She asked questions that were precise and clinical, and then sometimes stopped and listened to answers that were small and human. Belinda did not speak in platitudes. She gave facts, the ledger, the routine, the Friday pancakes. She spoke about the structural supports in place, school contact information, a therapist who would be recommended if needed, and a neighborhood program John had agreed to sponsor to create a quiet playgroup space. She did not promise miracles. She promised continuity. At some point, when the social worker's pen hovered between two boxes, John left his chair and stood near his sons. He had a way of being tall and apologetic at the same time, as if gravity and guilt had been competing to collapse him inward. He told Mrs. Rodriguez, plainly and without corporate language, about the nights he missed and the times he had thought that hiring someone could close the distance. He acknowledged his fear of failing his wife and of failing his children, and he said the words that mattered more than any formal assurance. "I am trying to be here." Mrs. Rodriguez did not become an oracle. She completed the forms. She marked things as needs monitoring and improvement observed. She returned to her office with pages and an assessment that noted both risk factors, public attention, staff turnover, and protective factors, consistent caregiver in Belinda, engaged father, tangible routines. Her final line in the report read the way a person who had seen many families might write when moved. Children are being seen and supported. Continued monitoring recommended. Encourage family to maintain rituals that build attachment. The headline cycle did not die because a social worker made a handwritten note. It changed, though. Pundits had something else to write, and some of them did. The camera crews lessened. People who had the time to be outraged found other outrages. The immediate roar softened, replaced by a low, persistent hum that meant the house could be left to its work. But it was not only institutions that had to be convinced. There were voices closer to home who needed a different kind of persuading. Among the staff who had worked in the Whitaker household for years, there were murmurs, questions about training, about protocols. One morning, the house manager left a list of recommended behavior plans on the kitchen counter, color-coded and efficient. Belinda read it and appreciated the thoroughness. She placed it next to her ledger and added a sticky note. Add children's choices. She wanted the adults' structures, but she understood that rules without consent felt like cages to children who had already been abandoned by the people meant to protect them. There was a night in November when John found Belinda at the sink, the small ledger open and a faint smudge of flour on her wrist. He had stayed late at the office to clear a meeting ringed by silence, and had come home to the quiet clatter of dishes. He stood in the doorway and for a long minute watched her finish rinsing a pan. The house smelled like lemon dish soap again, like the weather outside and the warmth inside braided into something ordinary. "You never really talked about yourself," John said, cautious. "At the interview you said you'd been through things. I don't know much about what you meant." Belinda set the wet pan in the drying rack and sat on the stool, the hem of her sweater catching on the wood. She rubbed the knuckles of one hand with the pad of her thumb in a small, nervous gesture she used when she thought before speaking. "My childhood was a series of doors," she said. She kept her voice steady, not because it was rehearsed, but because the past had been heavy enough to teach her the skill of simple sentences. There were people who stayed and people who left. I learned early that the difference between someone who helps you and someone who hurts you is whether they come back after the storm. In foster care, the world teaches you to make distance the armor. You grow up quick and learn to test whether anyone means it. Her fingers found the page of the ledger and traced a line. So when a child hits, or when they throw a bowl, it's not that they want to hurt you. It's usually a different language. Panic, fear. And the only way out of that language is someone who will let them use it and then sit with what's behind it. John listened, at first as if to a confidential report, then as if to confession. He had always admired people who could name things simply. The admission landed like a small gift. He understood then why Belinda did not flinch at a mess the way other people did, why she measured life in one-line notes and small rituals, why she had insisted on the pancake left on photo tradition in a house that had been all edges since Sarah died. "You said you weren't a magician at the start," he murmured. "You said you'd come back." She smiled. "I taught myself to come back," she said. "It's a practice. You come back and you do the dishes. You come back and you read the same story, even if you've read it 100 times. You come back when they push you. That's what repair looks like to me." He reached out, and her hand found his. It was not a cinematic hand-holding. It was the hand of two people who had learned to accept small, daily intimacies. He squeezed once, and then, quieter than he'd been in months, said, "I want to learn to come back like that." What followed were months that felt like a slow curriculum in ordinary things. Healing did not come in tidy leaps. Instead, it arrived in the size of a sandwich eaten without fight, and a morning where a boy got himself into school with one fewer tantrum. The ledger filled with more entries. Tommy shared toy unprompted. Danny read a book through without tearing the pages. Bobby asked about Mama with curiosity, not anger. Belinda kept the same quiet pleasure at these lines that a gardener keeps at seedlings pushing through dirt. School was a small frontier. The first parent-teacher meeting had been a test. The boys had been bounced from classrooms before, their behavior a storm that frightened other parents. Belinda attended with John and the teacher, an earnest woman who had a way of saying "we" that made everyone in the room feel less alone. The teacher described progress, improved attention spans, small friendships forming, and then, in a moment of candor, admitted the community's wariness. "People are worried," she said. "They look at the headlines." John responded differently than he would have months prior. He did not get defensive. He got present. He told the room simply who they were: a father learning, a hired caregiver who had become family, and 3 children who were being seen. He thanked the teacher and offered to volunteer at school events. The offer was unpolished, human, and crucial. It meant the kids were not only being cared for at home, their father was showing up in small, visible ways. Belinda began to enter other rooms of the boys' lives. She coordinated with a pediatrician to monitor sleep patterns. She took the boys to a community playgroup where other children made mistakes in safe spaces, and she arranged a regular memory hour at home where the boys could bring a photograph of Sarah and tell stories, factual or fanciful, about the mother they remembered and the mother they imagined. The memory hour was messy, sometimes a flood of crying, sometimes a giggling anecdote about a silly hat. But it created a pattern where absence had a shape and a place. There were setbacks. An article resurfacing a months-old clip could suddenly reopen a boy's wound. A friend's unkind whisper at a school bake sale could set off a fight in the back seat of the car. Once at the mall, a stranger took a call and said something that sounded like a judgment about parenting, loud enough that Tommy overheard, and then retreated into silence for the rest of the day. Belinda learned to recognize the patterns of such days and to prepare for them. An extra cookie in the bag, a new story in her pocket, a plan to come home and make pancakes. She called it triage, the hands-on, tender repair needed after the world punctures a small life. John's transformation was apparent in small rituals. He started taking the 7:30 school drop-offs when he could. He learned the boys' favorite flavors of yogurt and was proud when he could pronounce peach without stumbling. On a Saturday, he put aside the pitch deck that had been his entire life and painted with Danny a crooked lighthouse that made the whole kitchen look like a storm resolution in Technicolor. Belinda watched the two of them and felt a quiet relief that the man who had bought whole companies was learning to measure worth in pancakes and glue. There was a night when he sat in the garden with her and spoke about Sarah in a way that sounded like apology to a tombstone. "I thought if I controlled everything I could keep the world safe," he said. "But I was trying to keep pain out by building a fortress. I forgot that there is more need than omission. There is presence." He looked at Belinda, eyes luminous with a kind of rawness she had seen more than once in other fathers she had cared for, guilt, and the possibility of repair. Belinda did not correct him. She offered him a small edible metaphor, one of her pancakes. "Fortresses keep things out," she said, "but they also keep things from getting in." He laughed, a sound like relief. "Teach me to bring in," he said, and in the way he asked, there was a hope that he could be taught. As winter folded into spring, the house held a string of modest triumphs. The boys began to speak about Mama in the present tense more often than as a litany of loss. They braided the scarf into dolls and left it by their bed sometimes, and sometimes took it outside to fly their clay birds in the yard. Tommy drew a picture of his family with Sarah on a porch and handed it to John at breakfast. The father hung it on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a star. The ongoing media presence eventually shrank to a few commentary pieces and a long-form profile that tried to capture nuance, the kind of article that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, because nuance is a luxury for those who have time to write it. One feature, however, did something different. It requested an interview with Belinda not as a spectacle but as a practitioner. The reporter wanted to understand the ledger, the pancake ritual, the small, consistent gestures that had been her phrase. Belinda granted it on one condition: no cameras in the boys' rooms, no footage of names on school rosters. She told the reporter in a voice practiced for clarity, "Children's grief needs people who can be boringly consistent. It does not need algorithms of shame." The piece ran with more kindness than she expected. It did not make her famous. It made a handful of people think differently. The months accumulated, and small rituals became marrow. Birthday parties took place where the boys would blow out candles and make wishes for pockets of time. The Lees from next door, an older couple who had once whispered about spoiled wealth over hedges, started bringing over brownies. The house staff, who had been skeptical, elected to show Belinda their own small gestures of welcome. Someone brought extra coats for wet days. Another learned to switch a child's playlist to songs he liked. It was not that the world had turned. It was that the little circuits of care around the boys were realigning. There was a day in late spring when John took off from work entirely. He told no one. He simply did not log into the usual calls. He spent the morning with the boys building a small fort in the living room, one made from cushions and old sheets, and the enthusiastic belief that forts could contain stars. Belinda joined with a bowl of cookie dough on her lap, and together they baked a tray without any pretense of perfection. The boys smeared chocolate and giggled, their faces streaked with crumbs. John watched, and his face was the face of someone learning to become ordinary at the things that mattered. One evening, standing on the garden path while the boys chased a paper bird they had made from a magazine, John took Belinda's hand. The man who had once measured life in numbers and deadlines looked at her as if he were seeing an entirely new kind of value. He spoke in a voice that had the cracked, earnest edge of someone who had learned to be sincere. "You could leave," he said, half as confession and half as fear. "You could walk away like others did." Belinda smiled, thinking of small, warm dinners and thermoses still warm on cold mornings. "I didn't come for what the house has," she said. "I came for what it could become." He knelt in front of her without asking, as if the act itself had no need for ceremony. He produced a small ring the way he had once produced strategic plans, calculated, careful, and oddly gentle. "Will you marry me?" he asked. The boys, who had stopped in mid-chase, looked on as if this were a new kind of game. It was not your storybook proposal with trumpets and a crowd. It was quiet and private and wholly believable. Belinda let out a sound that was almost laughter and almost tears. She nodded. The boys, with a ceremonious unanimity, declared themselves to be in favor. They demanded cake. They wanted a best seat at the wedding, even if it was their mother's photograph who would not be there to applaud. They married in the garden that summer in a gentle ceremony that was more about affirmation than spectacle. The vows were simple: promises to be present, to keep the house a place where memory could be spoken of without fear. And the boys walked ring-bearer roles with solemn joy. Sarah's photograph sat beneath a small arch of flowers, not as an absence, but as a person named and remembered. Guests included neighbors and teachers, and a few staff members who had become allies. Some reporters asked for access and were politely turned away. The wedding was a private redoubling of an ordinary life. The months after the wedding were not a perfect straight line upward. There were nights with fever, afternoons in which footage from an angry op-ed resurfaced and the boys retreated for a day into silence. But the pattern of repair held. The ledger kept filling, and one of the lines read, "John attended school play, stayed the whole time." Another read, "Tommy asked about baby sister." There was quietly a seed of something new forming. When Lily was born, the house felt as if it had reorganized around a new axis. The baby arrived not as an answer to pain, but as a continuation of the family's practice of staying. John had insisted on being present for the delivery in a way he never would have imagined before Belinda. The boys met their sister in the hospital with skeptical curiosity, and then with a protective warmth that made Belinda's heart ache in a good way. They argued over who got to hold the tiny hand, and the nurses laughed at how fiercely small boys could guard a newborn's blanket. They named her Lily, because John liked the way the name sounded against the house's quiet. In the months that followed, the family settled into a new rhythm. Naps, dinners, the slow choreography of a household that now contained one more small body. Belinda watched the boys with a mixture of fierce pride and careful attention. They argued and loved in equal measures. They remembered Sarah, and also made room for new small memories. Lily's first laugh, a smear of baby frosting on the kitchen counter, a photograph of 4 children asleep with faces soft like recovered weather. Public life continued to press at the edges. John established a modest foundation, aimed at supporting local foster care programs and pilot training for trauma-informed caregivers. He did not build monuments. He funded a program that paid stipends to experienced caregivers to mentor new ones, and helped set up a small community center where parents could come to learn about steadiness as a practice. Belinda consulted, not as an image on a book jacket, but as someone who taught workshops on the basics. Small, consistent gestures. She titled a short pamphlet the foundation printed and distributed quietly at clinics and schools. Her name did not fill stadiums. It appeared on a modest website next to other useful resources. There were critics. Some said the money would not fix systemic problems. They were right. Some suggested the family sought redemption through philanthropy. Perhaps that was true too. But the foundation did one practical thing. It paid for a weekly playgroup where parents and caregivers could learn tactics learned in many living rooms. A thermos kept warm, a cake made and left at a photo, a routine that might outlast a rumor. The program became a ripple rather than a tsunami, and its modest success felt like the kind of change Belinda trusted, durable, not flashy. As the family's public life rebalanced from spectacle to routine, small rituals kept returning as anchors. Friday pancakes continued, now enlivened by Lily's squeals. The shoebox with clay items sat in a drawer rather than under a pillow, a reminder of the work they'd done. The ledger, now thicker, remained in the drawer beneath the sugar bowl. When strangers asked Belinda at the community center about her approach, she told them plainly about foster care, about learning to tolerate mess because mess is where children practice being whole again. She spoke with a quiet authority that did not claim mastery, only repeated practice. The boys, now older by a year or two, learned to speak about their mother in ways that were both honest and expansive. One afternoon at the grave, Tommy told a story about Sarah teaching him how to whistle using 2 fingers, an image that made them all laugh because none of them could quite reproduce it. Bobby left a small paper boat at the base of the stone, and Danny arranged his clay heart where the sun hit just so. The ritual was no longer only sorrow. It included jokes and memories and the kind of messy affection that said, without having to say, "We remember and we live." There came a quiet victory at school. A teacher emailed to say that Tommy had volunteered to help a new student at recess, offering a hand without complaint. The email landed in Belinda's inbox like a small medal. She read it and then made a note in her ledger. "Tommy helped," she wrote. "He stayed." One winter evening, when the house hummed with the low, comfortable noise of life, a dryer beating the last of the laundry, a soft radio in the study, Lily's breath a tiny metronome in the nursery, Belinda tucked Tommy, Danny, and Bobby into bed. The room smelled of milk and lavender and the faint, comforting shadow of the past. They asked for the moon story, the one Belinda had told on her first night, and she obliged. As she read, the boys interrupted with questions and small corrections, and a wild insistence that the moon should not wear shoes because it made the stars jealous. Tommy, who had learned to ask things, small, precarious requests, leaned in and said, in a voice that was half sleepy and half solemn, "Belinda, are you our mama now?" Belinda felt the weight of the question settle like a feather on the page of a book she'd been reading a long time. She knelt, cupped his face in both hands for the small ceremony of attention, and she did not offer an answer that would rewrite the reality. Instead, she gave the only honest thing a grown person could give to a child. "I am someone who loves you," she said. "I am here. I will come back. I will make room." It was a promise without a seal. It was the steady truth she had practiced for years. The boy drifted, the breath in his chest slowing into the rhythm of sleep. That night, after lights had been dimmed and the house had ceased its small orchestration of chores, John found Belinda at the kitchen table again, writing in the ledger. He sat and watched her for a long while. There was no flourish, only the quiet companionship that had grown between them. He reached across and brushed flour from her wrist. The gesture was reverent in its simplicity. "Our lives are messy," he said quietly. "I used to think I could fix things, with money, with time, with everything except the things that matter." She looked up, and his eyes were soft. "It's not fixed," she said. "It will never be fixed. It will be tended. And that's all any of us can do." He nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, as if for the 100 small repairs she had made on the evenings when his guilt felt like a physical weight. She smiled and reached for him in the way of people who had learned to hold each other's fragility with care. The public narrative mellowed. The earlier headlines were repurposed into a longer story about families who rebuild in public and the pitfalls of exposure. Belinda avoided interviews in which she would be asked to explain herself in pithy phrases. She liked instead to teach workshops at the Foundation's small community center, to sit at long tables with exhausted caregivers and hand them printed copies of Small Consistent Gestures, a pamphlet with checklists and stories, and the kind of mundane rituals that could be practiced in any kitchen. The attendees, many with their own histories of foster care or burnout, thanked her in ways that were not measured by likes or shares, but by the steady change that followed. A new routine, a thermos in a bag, an hour set aside for memory-making, years folded into one another like pages in the ledger. The boys grew taller. Tommy's hair became a soft mop above his brow. Danny's eyes held less sharpened edges. Bobby learned to fold his own napkin without being told. They argued loudly over who would push Lily on the swing and who would hold the pancake plate at Sarah's remembrance. The house filled with the ordinary noise of a family that continues despite everything. On the anniversary of Sarah's death, the family went to the grave not to mourn in a way that would erase joy, but to celebrate the thread that connected them. They brought pancakes in a thermos and a small cake they had baked together, and they sat on the grass and told stories that were alternately funny and tender. Neighbors who had once whispered about the family's spectacle came and sat on a blanket at the side, bringing cups of coffee and an apple pie, as if to say they had learned something too. Children ran with paper boats down a small stream nearby, and the sound of them made the afternoon feel less like a memorial and more like a festival of remembrance. John spoke then, not from a prepared speech but from a heart that had learned to say small, important things. "We have been held by people who know how to show up," he said. "We have been rescued not by money but by someone who chose to stay." He nodded toward Belinda, who stood at his side, hair catching the sun. The boys put their hands on Sarah's marker, and Lily, still small enough to fall asleep leaning against her father, exhaled and woke with a tiny smile. The gravestone, once a place of aching silence, was now a spot that held stories and small non-theatrical offerings. A clay bird, a sticky pancake plate, drawings with crooked suns. The ritual had changed shape. It did not mean they had moved on as much as they had learned to bring the memory into the room where life was being lived. Belinda continued her work. She never claimed to be a hero. She had, in the beginning, the things she always had: a history of being bored with spectacle and devoted to practice. She taught, she wrote in her ledger, she made time for the boys, and she insisted on honesty with public institutions when they came by. She refused to let headlines be the measure of a child's life. Her modest publications, workshop notes, a practical pamphlet, a few recorded talks that focused on the daily craft of caregiving, found their way to kitchens and waiting rooms. The foundation she helped run channeled resources to community programs and paid stipends to caregivers who had the lived experience to teach others. It was not a revolution. It was a slow changing of how small communities viewed care. Years later, at Lily's 4th birthday, the house overflowed with noise and laughter. The boys, not so small anymore, had secret plans to build a fort that would double as a castle. John moved among guests with a practiced lightness that showed he had relearned how to take joy without guilt. He had, in the quiet months, learned that presence is not always dramatic. It is routine, repetition, return. Belinda watched the children from the kitchen doorway and thought of a phrase she had written once: pain with nowhere to go. She recognized how the house had become a place where pain was permitted to be messy, and where it learned, eventually, to find an exit that led to being seen. She had not done anything unthinkable. No overnight miracles. No fancy tricks. She'd done the work of showing up and inviting others to do the same. On a night when the sky held rain but the house held a warmth like a hearth, she tucked in the boys and then Lily. The children mumbled their small, peculiar goodbyes, half prayers, half promises, and then slept. John kissed her forehead in the doorway, and when she looked up, mouthed the two words that had become simple and essential in this life. "Thank you." She smiled and closed the door quietly. In the kitchen, she opened her ledger one last time to write something she had wanted to say since the beginning, but had only now found the words for. She wrote, "Chosen family. Small, consistent gestures. Show up." She put the pen down and, without ceremony, tucked the ledger into the tin of cookies she had brought on her very first day. The tin was dented in one place, the dent a small memory of a bowl that had smashed months ago and had taught them to sweep and then return to the table for cake. Before bed, the family drove to Sarah's grave. They had a small picnic, pancakes wrapped in wax paper, syrup in a travel bottle, a thermos of coffee. The boys placed small presents around the stone, a clay bird, a drawing with a swing, a heart made of crinkled paper. Lily, fascinated by a ladybug, chased it and then sat down in the grass with the steady concentration of a child discovering something new. John knelt and lit a small candle they had brought, and the flame looked tiny against the vast sky. The boys sang a song they had invented for the mother they remembered. The words, a jumble of truth and fantasy. The melody, a crooked, heartfelt thing. Belinda stood a step back and watched them. The silliness of the song made the moment, paradoxically, more reverent. It was memorial and party and ordinary evening all folded together. When they left, John took Belinda's hand and did not say anything public, only the words that lived small and true in a home that had learned to tend itself. "Stay," he said, and in that word was a lifetime of learning. They went home, and Belinda read a story to Lily until the baby's eyes closed in deep sleep. Tommy stuck his head into the nursery doorway and mumbled, "Love you forever," the phrase carrying the softened edge of a child who had learned to make promises without expecting perfect answers. Belinda answered with the line she had first spoken when the boys were most feral and most fragile. "Love you forever," she said back, "because some promises are not fixed. They are practices, acts of daily return." Outside, feathers still drifted from a thrown pillow sometimes, remnants of an old chaos that had once defined a house. Inside, the family had reassembled itself not as a triumphant before and after, but as a living, imperfect portrait of staying. The story that had started on a doorstep with a tin of cookies had woven into something that would not be eradicated by headlines or hardened by criticism. The work of care continued, small and consistent, ordinary and brave. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that steady presence matters. Subscribe for more stories about family, resilience, and the unsung people who change lives.